The Forgotten Film. It was a rainy evening when Alex, a passionate horror movie buff, stumbled upon an old VHS tape at a garage sale. The label was faded, with the title barely legible, The Forgotten Film. Intrigued by the mystery of the tape, Alex bought it for a mere $1, not knowing the terror that awaited. At home, Alex dusted off the old VHS player and inserted the tape. The screen flickered, and after a moment of static, the film began. The grainy footage showed a dark, desolate house in the middle of nowhere. The camera moved shakily through the corridors, as if held by an amateur filmmaker. The eerie silence was only broken by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the whisper of the wind. As the camera panned through the house, Alex noticed something unsettling. In the background, there were fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures, barely visible in the corners of the screen. Their faces were obscured, but their presence was undeniable. Alex's heart raced, but the sense of dread was overpowered by curiosity. The film continued, showing a group of people, their faces twisted in fear, trapped in the house. They were trying to escape, but the doors wouldn't budge, and the windows were sealed shut. The camera followed them as they ran through the hallways, the shadowy figures always lurking just behind them. Then the screen went black. Alex leaned closer, waiting for the film to resume. Suddenly, the image of a pale, gaunt face filled the screen, its eyes lifeless and empty. It stared directly at Alex, as if it could see through the screen and into the room. A chill ran down Alex's spine. The figure opened its mouth, but no sound came out. The screen flickered again, and the film resumed. The characters in the movie were panicking now, realizing they were not alone. One by one, they began to disappear, dragged into the darkness by unseen forces. Their screams echoed through the house, but no one was there to hear them. As the last character was taken, the camera slowly turned towards the screen. It moved closer and closer, until all that could be seen was the dark void of the lens. Suddenly, the film cut to a static shot of the exterior of Alex's own house. The rain was pouring down, just like it was outside. Alex's breath caught in their throat. The camera moved, showing the inside of the house, room by room, until it reached the living room where Alex was sitting. The screen went black again, and Alex's reflection appeared in the darkened screen of the TV. Behind them, the shadowy figure from the film slowly emerged, its lifeless eyes locked onto Alex. The last thing Alex heard was the faint sound of static, before everything went dark. The Whispering Woods. In a small, isolated town surrounded by dense forests, there was a place the locals called the Whispering Woods. The name wasn't just a spooky nickname. People swore they heard whispers when they walked too close to the tree line. These whispers weren't carried by the wind but seemed to come from the trees themselves, as if the forest was alive and filled with secrets it wanted to share. Lucy, a curious and adventurous teenager, had always been drawn to the woods. She'd heard the stories from the older townsfolk, stories of people who had gone in and never returned, of strange symbols carved into the trees, and of ghostly figures seen wandering through the mist at dusk. But she didn't believe in such things. To her, the Whispering Woods was just a forest, and she was determined to prove it. One autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lucy decided it was time. Armed with a flashlight and her phone, she set off towards the woods, ignoring the warnings of her friends and family. As she approached the tree line, the whispers began, just as they always did. They were soft at first, barely audible over the crunch of leaves beneath her feet. But as she ventured deeper into the woods, they grew louder, more insistent. "Turn back," they seemed to say. "This is not your place." But Lucy was undeterred. She pressed on, her flashlight cutting through the thickening fog. The trees were ancient, their gnarled branches twisted into eerie shapes, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. The deeper she went, the more disoriented she became. The path she had been following seemed to disappear, replaced by a labyrinth of identical-looking trees. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her from all sides. They were no longer just voices, they were emotions. She could feel their fear, their anger, their sorrow. The realization hit her like a cold wave. These weren't just voices. They were the spirits of those who had been lost in the woods, trapped forever in this cursed place. Panic set in as Lucy tried to find her way back, but every direction looked the same. The whispers were no longer words but wails of despair. She felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder, and when she turned, she saw a shadowy figure standing just behind her. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted in a silent scream. Lucy stumbled back, but the figure didn't move. It simply watched her, its presence filling her with a deep, unshakable dread. Desperate, she broke into a run, weaving between the trees, but the forest seemed to close in around her. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices, all begging her to leave. But it was too late. The woods had claimed her. Lucy's flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. She could feel the presence of the shadowy figures all around her, closing in. The last thing she heard before everything went silent was a single, clear whisper, unlike the others. It was calm, almost soothing. "Welcome home." The next morning, when the search party was sent out, they found no trace of Lucy. Her phone, her flashlight, even the path she had taken. All were gone, swallowed by the whispering woods. The townsfolk added her name to the long list of those who had disappeared in the forest, another victim of the whispers. And from that day on, the whispers grew louder, as if the woods had gained another voice. The silent portrait. In the heart of a sleepy, fog-covered village stood an old, decrepit mansion that had long been abandoned. The townspeople whispered tales of the mansion being cursed, haunted by the spirits of its former residents. But no one knew the truth, for no one had dared to enter, except for an artist named Evelyn. Evelyn had recently moved to the village, drawn by the picturesque scenery and the quiet solitude it offered. She had heard the stories about the mansion, but she was more intrigued than frightened. One day, seeking inspiration for her next painting, she decided to explore the old house. Armed with her sketchbook and pencils, she pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of mildew hung in the air. The interior of the mansion was a labyrinth of decaying grandeur, with faded tapestries hanging from the walls and broken furniture scattered across the floors. But what caught Evelyn's eye was a massive portrait hanging in the grand hallway. The portrait depicted a beautiful woman, dressed in an elegant gown, her eyes cold and lifeless. There was something unsettling about her expression, a faint, mocking smile that seemed to hide a dark secret. The paint was old and cracked, yet the eyes seemed almost alive, as if they were watching Evelyn's every move. Evelyn was captivated by the portrait. She felt an inexplicable connection to the woman in the painting, a desire to understand her story. She decided then and there that she would recreate the portrait, capturing the haunting beauty of the woman with her own brush. Days turned into weeks as Evelyn spent every waking hour in the mansion, sketching the portrait. The more she worked, the more obsessed she became. She began to dream of the woman, vivid nightmares in which the woman whispered to her in a language she couldn't understand. The dreams left Evelyn exhausted, but she couldn't stop. She was driven by an unseen force, compelled to finish the painting. As she worked, strange things began to happen. Objects in the mansion would move on their own. Shadows flickered in the corners of her vision, and the temperature in the room would drop suddenly, making her breath visible in the cold air. But the most disturbing thing was the portrait itself. Each time Evelyn returned to the mansion, the woman's expression seemed to change ever so slightly. The mocking smile grew wider, the eyes more intense, as if the woman were coming to life. One night, as Evelyn was putting the finishing touches on her painting, she felt a presence behind her. She turned, but there was no one there, just the silent, empty mansion. But when she looked back at her painting, her blood ran cold. The woman in the portrait was no longer smiling. Her expression was one of pure terror, her eyes wide with fear, as if she were warning Evelyn of something. Then Evelyn heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was the same voice from her dreams, and this time she understood the words. "Help me." Suddenly, the room grew unbearably cold. Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps as she looked around frantically. The walls seemed to close in on her, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. She tried to move, but her feet were rooted to the spot. The whisper grew louder, more urgent. "Help me." Evelyn felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. The whisper echoed in her mind, a plea that she couldn't ignore. She knew what she had to do. With trembling hands, she picked up her brush and painted over the woman's face, erasing the terror from the portrait. As she did, the mansion began to shake violently, as if the very foundations were being torn apart. But Evelyn kept painting, covering the portrait in layers of black paint until the woman's image was completely gone. The shaking stopped, and the room fell silent. The oppressive cold lifted, and Evelyn collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. The portrait was gone, and with it, the malevolent presence that had haunted her. But as Evelyn lay there, catching her breath, she noticed something odd. The black paint was starting to crack, revealing the faint outline of the woman's face beneath it. And then she realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that the woman's expression had changed once more. She was smiling again. The next morning, the villagers found the mansion in ruins, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. There was no sign of Evelyn, except for her sketchbook, which lay open on the floor. The last page showed a crude drawing of the woman in the portrait, her cold eyes staring out from the paper, her mocking smile etched in charcoal. The villagers whispered that the mansion had claimed another victim, adding her to the portrait's silent collection. And though the mansion itself was gone, the legend lived on, the story of the artist who vanished, and the cursed portrait that continued to haunt the village. The phantom train. Every town has its own ghost stories, and in the small rural town of Hollow Creek, the most chilling tale was that of the phantom train. According to legend, the train appeared once every year on a cold, foggy night. It was said to be a relic from a tragic accident that occurred over a century ago. A train that had derailed on a stormy night, plunging into a deep ravine and killing everyone on board. The bodies were never recovered, and neither was the train. But on that one night each year, the phantom train was rumored to reappear on the old, abandoned tracks, carrying the souls of the lost passengers, still searching for their final destination. Lena had heard the story her entire life. Her grandfather had told it to her when she was a child, warning her to stay away from the old tracks on foggy nights. But like most people, she dismissed it as nothing more than a ghost story, a way to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. That is, until the night she saw the train herself. It was late October, and the town was blanketed in a thick, heavy fog. Lena was driving home from a late shift at the diner when she decided to take a shortcut through the old railway crossing. The fog was so dense that she could barely see a few feet in front of her, but she knew the road well and didn't think much of it. As she approached the crossing, her headlights caught something unusual. Two faint, glowing lights in the distance, like the headlights of an old locomotive. They seemed to hover just above the tracks, slowly moving toward her. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She knew the tracks hadn't been used in decades. The nearest train station had been abandoned long ago. Curiosity got the better of her, and she pulled over to the side of the road, stepping out of the car to get a better look. The lights grew brighter, and she could now make out the silhouette of an old steam engine emerging from the fog, its once grand exterior now rusted and decayed. The train moved slowly, silently, as if gliding along the tracks rather than riding on them. Lena watched in stunned silence as the train drew closer, its windows dimly lit from within. As it passed by, she could see the passengers, pale, ghostly figures, their faces expressionless, eyes vacant. They sat silently in their seats, staring straight ahead as if unaware of the world around them. The air around her grew icy cold, and Lena felt a chill run down her spine. The train's whistle blew, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo from another time. But as the last carriage passed, something strange happened. The train began to slow down, and Lena could see one of the doors creaking open. A figure stepped out onto the platform, shrouded in fog. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothing. He looked directly at Lena, his eyes hollow and dark, as if they held the weight of a century's worth of sorrow. The man raised a bony hand, beckoning her to come closer. Lena's instincts screamed at her to run, to get back in her car and drive away, but she found herself rooted to the spot, unable to move. The man's lips moved, but no sound came out. Still, Lena understood his message as clearly as if he had spoken aloud. "Help us!" The man stepped closer, reaching out to her, but just as his fingers brushed her skin, the train's whistle blew again, this time louder, more insistent. The man hesitated, then stepped back, disappearing into the fog as the train began to move again, picking up speed. The door slammed shut, and the train continued its ghostly journey, vanishing into the night as quickly as it had appeared. The fog lifted, and the cold dissipated, but Lena was left standing there, shaken and confused. She knew what she had seen wasn't a hallucination. The phantom train was real, and its passengers were trapped in an endless loop, forever searching for a way to reach their final rest. Over the next few days, Lena couldn't shake the memory of the train. She began researching the history of the old railway, digging through archives and old newspapers. She discovered that the train had indeed derailed on a stormy night, killing over 100 passengers. The cause of the accident was never determined, and the victims were buried in a mass grave near the tracks, their names forgotten by time. Determined to help the souls of the lost passengers find peace, Lena returned to the site of the crash on the next foggy night. She brought with her a bouquet of flowers and a lantern, placing them at the base of an old, rusted signpost that marked the spot where the train had derailed. She stood there in silence, offering a prayer for the dead. As she finished, the fog thickened, and she heard the distant sound of a train whistle. The phantom train appeared once more, gliding along the tracks toward her. But this time, when it passed by, the faces of the passengers were different. They looked peaceful, their expressions serene, as if they had finally found the closure they had been seeking. The man who had reached out to her before was there again, standing on the platform. He nodded to her, a silent thank you, before stepping back into the train. The whistle blew one final time, and the train disappeared into the night, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of smoke and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Lena knew she had done the right thing. The phantom train would never haunt Hollow Creek again, but the memory of that night would stay with her forever, a reminder that some spirits are trapped not by their own will, but by the weight of unfinished business, waiting for someone to set them free.